Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. This is our general topic for today is early years apprentices and looking at new opportunities for employment and training. Michael just explained really that my role will be to chair and to filter the questions as they come in. And I'll formally introduce myself. I'm Velda Bartholomew, and I'm the Training Operations Manager. So I sort of work with apprentices on a day-to-day basis from the training organisation aspect.
And my name is Michael Freeston. I'm Director of Quality Improvement at the preschool end.
Okay, so the structure of the session today, it's very similar to a normal type seminar. The only difference being it's on the web. And there will be a 15 to 20 minute presentation, and then there'll be 25 to 30 minutes for your questions and your comments. But please do feel free to type in questions at any time, because the whole webinar usually works better and it's a dialogue, and you're giving us the questions as we go along, so we know what you're thinking and we can give you the information you require. Okay, so I'm going to now formally hand over to Michael, who will start the presentation, and I'll be looking out for your questions.
Thank you, Velda. Many of you will have heard, I hope, on the news about the development of an apprenticeship levy that's being introduced by government from April and May of this year. And you will have heard that actually it's for large employers whose salary bill is over £3 million. By my calculation, roughly speaking, in the early years sector, that means you need to be a chain nursery provider of somewhere between about 12 to 15 settings in order to be getting a salary bill near about £3 million. I'm not sure if anybody who's attending today is in that bracket, but I do get the sense when I'm speaking to our member settings that they've just assumed, well, actually the apprenticeship levy and the new funding arrangements are nothing to do with us because we're not affected by the levy. That's why we felt this was an important topic on which to hold a webinar, because that is not the case. The funding for apprenticeships generally is changing with effect from the 1st of April. And anybody who is looking to employ an apprentice and support their training and development will be affected by the new rules. So don't feel as though because you're not a large employer this doesn't apply to you. It does. The second comment by way of introduction is an acknowledgement that apprenticeships historically have not been universally popular in the early years sector. When I first joined this organisation, I also took on the role as being a trustee of CASH, the awarding organisation, and I was genuinely surprised at how poor take-up was of apprentices through the information that came back from there, but also there was an understandable concern on the part of practitioners, because if you recall, in the original framework, practitioners had to take 2 qualifications. There was the work-based element and then the vocational full and relevant factor, the learning and underpinning knowledge. And also, I have to say, there was some poor training provision, and it was often said, I was astonished at the number of people who were undertaking apprenticeships that were college-based who never actually went into a setting. So it's understandable that employers at times were somewhat sceptical about the skills, knowledge and competence of the people who would join them after having done their apprentices. However, as the title of this slide suggests, I would like to take this opportunity over the next 15 to 20 minutes to talk through about why early years employers should now actively consider taking on apprentices. I hope I'm going to convince you. If you have any comments of anything that I say over the next period of time, in the next few slides, please do send them in and we'll consider them when they pop up on our screen. Right, first of all, an increase in volume of provision. The 30 hours entitlement for working families comes in from September 2017. Government is convinced that this will lead to a huge increase in demand, therefore an onus on us as a sector to increase supply and to get larger. And with all the pressures in terms of funding levels, which is not the issue of today's seminar, consideration about how we can expand our size in terms of our numbers of members of staff to deal with and care for larger numbers of children will clearly be something to which managers are currently turning their attention in setting their budgets. And I think apprentices may well have a role to play in this, because it allows you to employ a motivated new member of staff at an affordable pay rate. You can see I've chosen my words carefully there, and we'll talk about pay rates in a second. And also, one of the points that I know Velda will comment on as we go through, making sure you get the right person is essential to a successful apprenticeship outcome. We'll say more about that in due course, but I think the sentiment holds. An apprenticeship is the opportunity to employ a motivated new member of staff at an affordable pay rate. It also allows you to develop a well-trained and highly motivated member of your staff to the standards you expect as an employer. You can take somebody and mould them in your image, and what you expect as an employer you can create with the individual who has come to your employment. You will take a key role in structuring the training of that staff member. So again, that links to the point previously. But there's always a concern raised by employers that actually people come to them being trained by other organisations and by other training providers, not in their ethos, and they really have to start from the bottom in training them again in some situations. And actually, I would argue that if you employ an apprentice, you can bypass that issue because you can structure the training to suit your needs. Hopefully, that all leads to a loyal member of staff who stays with you. You may have some comments on that, but I'm putting that as a consideration. And presents new ideas into the setting as an apprentice gains up-to-date knowledge on current practice. Again, this is worded very carefully, but Velda has often said to me that employers very much welcome new eyes and new ideas into a setting where they've got an established staff team who may not have been the keenest in terms of keeping their professional development up to speed and keeping up with new research, etc. So actually bringing a new catalyst into that environment can be beneficial to the setting as a whole. I would also argue that apprentices fit very much the grow your own ethos of our sector. The idea that we can provide career opportunities to career change mums or fathers to actually come into a sector and build up their skills in a new area which they may not have considered before. Apprenticeships facilitate that and allow us to live our own ethos. And finally, don't forget, an apprentice from the age of 16 can be counted in the ratios if you, as the employer, believe that he or she is competent and responsible. That's just been restated in the new version of the early years foundation stage, and it is a year earlier than other training, staff on training numbers, so they can count in the ratio. So, I suppose I should start at the beginning, assuming I've convinced you that apprentices are a good thing to do. What is an apprentice? An apprenticeship, an apprenticeship is a job with an accompanying skills development program. Apprentices cannot be employed solely to deliver an apprenticeship. There must be a genuine job available after they have completed their apprenticeship. Velda's just taking me on to the next slide. There we go. This is the definition given by government, and I think it's the interesting point that an apprenticeship combines working and learning. And what's interesting is you can't just take on an apprentice for a period of time and then say that's it, there's nothing for you to move on to. There has to be a genuine job available, but that does not mean they have to get the job. One of the things we'll come on to in later slides is that there is no special employment security as an apprentice. They have the same, you have the same rights, terms and conditions as other members of staff, and we'll address that in due course. So there has to be a real job. That's not the same as saying that the apprentice has to get that job.
Okay, we just had a question, and the question is regarding having a new member of staff and to invigorate the setting. And the question says, that's all assuming the setting is up to date and that your ethos is acceptable.
I think that's a fair comment, Tracy. We're assuming lead practice here, best practice, and a commitment of all that actually your setting is one into which you would like to welcome new eyes, etc. Your point is well made. Yes, thank you, Tracy. The apprentice gains their skills and experience through a wide mix of learning in the workplace, formal off-the-job training, and we'll talk more about that, and the opportunity to practice new skills in a real work environment. One of the points that often comes up is, what's the minimum contract period of time? The minimum for an apprenticeship is 1 year, and it should be, best practice demonstrates that it should be a full-time job. Now, the minimum contractual arrangement is 16 hours per week, but our experience both as a training provider and as an employer means you should try to have the person working in your setting for as much of the time as is possible and that your budgets allow. So because what you're trying to do here is immerse the individual in all aspects of your setting, and that means trying to offer a full-time contract wherever possible. And let's face it, you're trying to, where may well be a young person or somebody returning to work, you are trying to create the general work commitment and ethos that will be necessary should they stay with you or if they go somewhere else. The off-the-job training bit is an interesting one. It's defined which is learning which is undertaken outside of normal day-to-day working environment and leads towards the achievement of an apprenticeship. It can include training that is delivered at the apprentice's normal place of work, but must not be delivered as part of the normal work duties. So what we're saying about it is it's a 20% period of time. So if you've got a member of staff for 5 days, one of those days, 20%, has to be made available for them to study off the job. Now this is an important consideration when you're thinking about ratios, etc. But it is still causing issues in terms of definition about what counts. There was an article recently which said that this cannot be support for if your apprentice also has maths, English and ICT support needs in order to achieve the apprenticeship. The off-the-job training has to focus on the vocational skills and knowledge development for the early years qualification.
Okay, we have a question here from John. How do we evidence the off-the-job training?
It's an interesting one, John. We have found that many employers include this in the supervision notes that they offer for all staff, and they've amended their documentation for their apprentices so that they can include progress on making comment on the progress of the learning program as well as the competency and skills in the setting itself. And also the training provider with whom you'll work, and we'll come on to that in a second, also should be able to make available to you evidence of progress on a half-termly or a termly basis. So I think it's one of those things that you have to be able to evidence that you've done it. But again, that will be something that's important for the training provider, so they will be working with you to make sure that evidence is available. Okay, thank you. Oh, next slide, it's not moved on. So, how do we go about getting an apprentice? There are two ways to employ an apprentice. You can retrain an existing member of staff as an apprentice into a new role. So if you've got a level 2 member of staff and you feel as though he or she is in a position to take on a level 3 areas of work, then that can become an apprentice. In those situations, you should honour his or her existing terms and conditions. or you can offer a vacancy to a new apprentice. The minimum pay rate is £3.50 per hour, but again I'll refer to the comment we made earlier on that actually paying a higher level, if your budgets allow, paying a higher level is very beneficial. Our experience both as an employer and as a training provider has demonstrated that if you're able to offer a higher rate, you attract a higher level of applicant, and also you hugely increase your chances of success and all those positive outcomes we started the session with. So again, consideration of the salary to which you will be able to extend is an important consideration. The word about the terms and conditions. An apprentice is treated in exactly the same way as your full employees. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to call them here, but it's your existing members of staff. They have no particular protected status. We've had situations in the past where employers have said, well, it really wasn't working out, but I didn't feel as though I could get rid of them because they were studying on their learning program. That is not the case. They are an employee. So if you do have concerns, then all of your existing policies and procedures about checking for competence or offering support or any sanctions if they're not turning up on time, etc. They are subject to the same terms and condition requirements as any other member of staff.
Okay, we've just got a question here from Julia. What if the training provider and the setting disagree on the quality of the apprenticeships programme?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We've had this as a training provider, and we have at times changed the setting that the apprentice was in. That was fortunate we were able to do that because of links we had with both employers, and it led to a successful outcome. But so close liaison with your training provider who's supporting the apprentice is the first step. But I suppose if it gets to a point where you fundamentally disagree and there can be no compromise, the point being here, that apprentice is a member of your staff and therefore would be subject to disciplinary procedures and could lead ultimately to dismissal. There is no reason why you should have to accept lower standards of commitment or competence because of the apprentice than you would from your other members of staff. So it is an interesting point, but we always try and reach a compromise and consider how best to meet both the employers and the apprentice's needs, but they are an employee, so they can be treated as the same as anybody else. Oh, Debbie. A question from Debbie. I'm a childminder. How do I meet the requirement of breaks? If I take 3 extra children when I have an apprenticeship, then they go on a break, I'll be over my numbers. Childminders don't get breaks. That's an excellent comment, Debbie. And I think that's more of a statement than a question. It does set an interesting challenge in terms of how a childminder would support the development of an apprentice. I suppose, I'm thinking back to the issue we said in terms of early years foundation stage, that if you are confident that the apprentice is competent and, I've forgotten the phrase, the wording is, if they are competent and, oh no, it's going to annoy me now, it's in the EYFS, I should have my copy to hand, then actually I think they would continue to be, as long as you're not going over ratio with those 3 extra children, I think you'd have to bear that in mind, then there would be that issue of you being able to have your loo breaks for the first time. And again, I'm not an expert in childminder ratios, but there is that issue in terms of site being able there and how childminders are able to action their necessary toilet breaks. Responsible was the other. Thank you, Celia, for your, I couldn't find my papers in time. Debbie, can you leave that question with me? and I will find a more thorough answer than the one I've just been trying to scramble with at the moment, because this is an interesting point, because this is where the childminder becomes an employer, maybe for the first time. And so there are considerations which is unusual for an apprenticeship arrangement. And what I'll try and do is respond to that as a specific question when this webinar is uploaded onto our YouTube site and I'm able to circulate the slides as well. So I'm sorry if I've rather waffled that answer, but it's a very interesting question and I'll try and get some clearer response. Thank you. And as I said, the 20% of the paid contract time is to be for off-the-job study. So this person, whilst they're studying, they still have to be paid, and that clearly has implications both in terms of the salary level and the impact on your budget, but also, back to Debbie's point, in terms of your ratios. You'll have to give due consideration to your ratios being met whilst the apprentice is being given their paid time to do their study. So how does the learning and assessing take place? The apprentice will have to be taught through a registered apprentice training provider. This is a growth area, and I imagine many of you as employers will be getting lots of phone calls promoting apprentice training provision, especially if you're in disadvantaged areas, for reasons I'll come on to in a later slide. So your apprentice will have to be on a registered training program who will provide them with a structured learning program to cover the knowledge elements of the course. However, because this is working and learning at the same time, you as the employer are seen as central to the training of the apprentice's work-based skills and competencies. So the role of the training provider is very much around ensuring that the apprentice has access to all the learning and the knowledge that is required to pass all the elements of the apprenticeship. It is seen as the role of the employer that they support that or show how that learning is then applied in practice with the skill and develop the skills and competencies. And at the end of the apprentice, there is a review which focuses on the apprentice's next steps. Now this might be moving into full employment with you, or it might be if you feel as though you're not suitable for them, or they're not suitable for you, then you are required, the expectation is that you will work with the training provider to see if there are other, that the person has the skills necessary to be able to go to interviews elsewhere. I had an interesting example recently where the apprentice had successfully completed a level 2 apprenticeship, but the setting was not able to take them to level 3 because they didn't have a baby room. And so obviously for the level 3 early years educator qualification, there's a requirement that across all the age ranges, and that they felt they were unable to do that because they didn't have a baby room themselves. So it was either an issue of looking for another employer, or maybe, and this is getting really creative, to second that apprentice to another provider so that she, and it was a she, could get the experience of working in the baby room necessary without actually leaving the primary employer. Next. And as I say, it may be that the end of apprentice review requires some skill support in terms of applying for other vacancies if he or she is not going to be staying with you. So, the important point, and just by way of summary we wanted to look at, was these are the issues you should consider if you're turning your mind to the possibility of employing an apprentice. Are you able to identify a role which an apprentice can fill? Now this might be an existing role into which you're looking to appoint, or for all the reasons I've mentioned in terms of increasing demand across the sector, do you feel as though there is scope to employ new people and that an apprentice may be an appropriate one to fill that role? Can you offer a long enough contract to ensure the apprentice can work and learn? As I said, the minimum contract time is 1 year. That's not a maximum time. It doesn't necessarily all have to be completed in that period of time, but the minimum requirement is for 1 year. Have you researched your funding options and given some thought to salary? I'm sure you wouldn't even started these considerations if you haven't given thought to salary, but it's there by way of a checklist for you. Are you able to ensure release of the apprentice for 20% of their contract for off-the-job study during work time? Again, this is something that is within the new funding framework, and I think will evolve over time in terms of how this is interpreted by employers and by government. Furthermore, can you identify a member of staff who can be available to act as a mentor for the apprentice? Our experience has indicated that almost having a key person is a really valuable focus for the apprentice to be the person who's the go-to if there's a question, if there are any concerns, etc. However, the next point linked to that is an apprenticeship is a team game. The best results come where the entire staff team is committed to supporting the development of the skills and helps train the staff member. So if you feel as though your staff are a supportive group, then you go a long way to offering a very constructive environment to any apprentice who comes along. Are you able to carry out regular one-to-one meetings, supporting the training provider to ensure the apprentice has a clear picture of their progress and achievement? I think this relates back to the earlier question we had, it's this opportunity for regular supervision, but also close engagement with the training provider that hopefully should avoid that situation arising where you think that the apprentice isn't doing very well, but the training provider feels as though everything in the garden is rosy. By having regular meetings and regular contact with the training provider, I would hope that you're in a position to avoid that becoming a crisis.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. Can I employ an apprentice term time only? And if so, do I have to pay them during the school?
Thank you, Debbie. This is an interesting point, especially for much of our sector, which is term time only. When we're talking about the 20% training option, there is no requirement that that is every Friday, for example. So you could extend the learning element into the holiday period, but I take it back to the original point, that should be paid. So clearly that's a consideration of how you balance your budgets with that, but certainly it is a sensible consideration to think about, hang on, I can have the person in ratio all the period of time, but actually they'll do their study in the holiday times, but you do have to consideration to payment as well.
Okay, and another question in the same area. Does the 20% off the job training have to be given and paid as 1 day off per week?
No, sorry, Kerry. No, that's the same point. It doesn't have to. It's a percentage, but it's not determined how it's paid. So actually, you could do a week if you wish to for a whole term, because that would be your 5 weeks for a half term, maybe. So there are creative ways in which this can be done without having a negative impact on the ratios or the time spent in the setting. The best thing to do with these situations is to write to me, and my emails, I'm not sure it's on these slides, but I can forward on to our apprentice experts to work out the best model and way in which it can be done in your circumstances. So the simple answer is yes. How best to make it work in your particular setting circumstances, we can advise and we can support you in getting the way that it works best for you and the apprentice. Celia has asked, I presume we should be paying for the 20% study time. Oh yes. You can see why this has become quite a contentious issue with many large employers, that they're having the apprenticeship levy taken off them, and they might be losing somebody who's working 5 days a week for them. Now they'll be working 4 whilst they're doing their study time in the other 20%. This will be interesting to see how this comes out.
They do need it, to be fair. You know, there's quite a lot of work, and there's maths and English and ICT, and you know they do need that time to do that.
I also think it addresses the concern the sector has always had about the quality of apprenticeships. If we are serious about saying it should be learning and working at the same time, then I think it should be seen as an investment. I know that's an easy thing to say, Celia, but we can't, on the one hand, complain that people don't learn enough on apprenticeships and then actually be concerned when we don't give them the opportunity to actually go and do that learning. Debbie says, presumably I also have to pay for holiday periods. Does this have to be the equivalent to their normal weekly pay? Again, the circumstances around salary, they are a member of staff the same as your, on the same term, well, the same conditions as your other members of staff, Debbie. So again, the circumstances around which you pay your existing team, those will be transferable over to the apprentice as well in terms of availability and hours. The pay rate might be different, but again, have those conversations with us when you're giving consideration to an apprentice, and we can advise on how best to fit it into the way you operate. But again, however you contract your termly staff in your team, it can be applied across.
Debbie's a team member, I think. Is that, yeah, sorry, she should, yeah. I think the same really she was talking about breaks in the previous question, that you'd have to let us know your circumstances.
Yes, we would be able to advise on that in a particular way, but it is an interesting point for childminders. And also, are you able to support visiting assessors to carry out skills assessment in the workplace? This will be the training providers coming in to ensure that the learning is taking place, and obviously making time available for you, because they'll be interested in knowing how the individual is settling into the setting, how their progress is, etc. So all of that previously applies no matter what size of an employer or what your salary bill is. So the consideration now is what's different between the large employers and the small ones. Just by way of background, the government has a target to have 3 million apprentices employed and trained by 2020. That's not just ours in early years, you'll be pleased to know. That's across the UK. But they do see health and social care, so that's early years and adult social care, as a major contributor to the apprenticeship training expansion programme. So we are very much under the microscope. It wants employers and individuals to take on more of the financial responsibility for training apprentices. I'm sure you're no doubt aware that actually government money to individuals and to training providers to support qualifications is being moved from the state as a percentage more to individuals and employers. The argument being, from a Conservative government, that actually it's the individuals and the employers who benefit from a more highly skilled and qualified workforce. Therefore, they should be encouraged, and I use that word carefully, to contribute more to that training taking place. So what they're doing, the loans for those training at level 3, originally you'll be aware that it was for people who were aged 24 plus. That is now from age of 19. The levy for employers with a salary bill, as I mentioned earlier, of over £3 million per year. I'm assuming, unless anybody puts their hand up to say otherwise or makes a comment, that nobody who's attending today is in that bracket. It's a whole different webinar that we've got if you're a levy-paying employer, and I can talk you through that, but that wasn't the focus of today's session. For non-levy-paying employers, which is most of our sector, co-invest is the word they use. Basically it means pay. You will be required to pay 10% of the cost of an apprentice's training. You might be aware, if you've undertaken apprentices or if you've supported people with their early years educator level 3 qualification in the past, there was an expectation that employers paid 50% of the cost. In reality, many training providers basically waived that cost and just took less money themselves, and it appeared as though the training was free to employers. That situation will change because now you will have to pay 10% of the cost of the training, which as it currently stands, the funding cost for the level 3 apprentice is expected to be in the region of about £2,500. So 10% of that is £250. That is meant to be evidenced by the training provider to show that it's actually being paid. Again, quite how that gets evidenced and audited, we shall have to wait and see. But the expectation of paying some money towards it, which previously existed, is expected to now become a requirement that it's 10%. And there is an additional payment of £1,000 for you as an employer if you recruit a 16 to 18-year-old as an apprentice. And I think this is an important element because, again, there's a recognition that actually younger apprentices may need more support, may be slightly more challenging to assimilate into a setting, and that employers are rewarded in a way with £1,000 that is paid straight to the setting if you take on an apprentice in that age range. There are also extra payments to training providers who operate in disadvantaged areas, recognising that apprentices from disadvantaged areas may need more support to get them through the vocational elements of their training. So there are bands and additional money which are paid to the training providers. So I think from an employer's perspective, it's important to give consideration to the fact that you may be phoned up by lots of training providers really trying to sell you the idea of an apprentice because they will end up getting more money for that as we take it on.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions.
All right, so let's see what we can do.
Right if I just interrupt there? First one's from Debbie. I close 4 weeks per year as it's, is it acceptable to state this is their holiday period and any other leave they take is unpaid?
As I said, Debbie, I think the most general answer I can give here is back to the fact that the terms and conditions will mirror the circumstances with other members of staff that you have. In terms of a specific on that, if you will email me your email address, I will get further clarification from our specialists and can correspond with you directly on that.
Okay. And is the 10% of cost dependent on the size of business?
No,
Debbie?
the 10% is relation to the actual cost of the apprenticeship, so no it isn't.
Okay, and Kerry has said, I have just taken on 2 apprentices last week for 30 hours a week each. One had 1 day off, previous appointment, and has now gone sick for the last 2 days. I signed a contract with the training provider saying I would pay her 30 hours a week. Do I have to pay her 30 hours this week as she has gone sick? Also, I have been told she must do 30 hours every week, but I do not have 30 hours during the holidays. Do I still pay her 30 hours?
Kerry, send me your email address. I will get a specific answer to that. The one thing I would say is that these funding, the framework we're talking about comes into effect in April of this year. So any apprentices you've taken on now are under a different arrangement regime. So I wouldn't like to answer that specifically because it's not my area of expertise. Email me your address and I will get those who have better knowledge than me to answer the question.
One thing I would say, Kerry, is contact your training provider straight away. If that was one of our apprentices, we'd want to know that that's happening. So just, Sarah, I work in a primary school and we are planning on taking on an apprentice for 2-year-old provision, which will be starting in January 17.
18, she's just corrected us.
Oh, sorry, 18. I'm listening in just to see if there's any advice on the best way to recruit.
Velda, I think that's probably one for you. You've led on most of our recruitment. What advice would you give to Sarah?
Okay, the best advice for a recruit is to take some time to get the best person you can. Our biggest successes are where we've had recruitment days and we've had suitable people apply for the position, and we don't do anything else except focus on those applicants. They do initial assessments, so we're sure of their English and maths levels, with capability. We talk to them about why they want to do the position. We look at what experience they have. We ask what their expectations are. We'll give them scenarios and ask how they would cope and what they would do. And then we really look at interviewing with the manager, or in your case, whoever's in charge. And so we have an opinion as a training provider, and then where they're going to employ has the final say, purely because they've got to fit in well with the team. But it's a joint approach from the training provider and the employer, and we're just the best match for the organisation, really.
And certainly in terms of the feedback that comes to me from all the staff involved in this, I would just underline that point that Velda made. Get it right at the beginning. If you're not sure, I suppose erring on the side of caution would be the way forward. Kerry's come back, and thank you for your email address, Kerry. My training provider told me I could apply for an age grant of £1,500 after 13 weeks for taking on these two apprentices. I think, again, this figure she's questioning, is that the £1,000? I think it's because we are talking about two different funding arrangements. Again, I'll try and get that more clearly clarified in the email back to you directly, Kerry.
Unless it's 16 to 19.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think the questions that are coming through and indicate that there is this level both of interest but also in terms of concern, because let's face it, you're taking on a member of staff, and that should not be done lightly. You wouldn't take on a member of staff in a normal circumstance without giving due consideration and making sure you get the right person. Don't do anything differently for an apprenticeship. But I would like to leave you with a testimonial. For those of you who will receive your copy of April's Under 5, for those of you who are members of the Preschool Learning Alliance, in the April, I've written an article on which much of this webinar is based. And there's a testimonial that comes, and I'm sure she won't mind me saying, Kelly Priest, who's manager at Rushwick Preschool in Worcestershire. She employed Rosie as a level 2 apprentice. And in the testimonial, she said that she feels that it's been a very positive impact on the setting because, as Velda said earlier on, she's brought new eyes to their practice and encouraged all to reflect on how their provision for the children, and she will look to employ other apprentices in the future. But I was really pleased with the quote, and this was completely unprompted. The best thing about it has been, it's been lovely to see somebody grow as Rosie has. And I would hope that will be the experience replicated across the entire country. Getting the right person into the right environment that's well supported with a good training provider, there's no reason why that can't be achieved everywhere.
And Sarah's put, thank you. Do you have any examples of basic skills, questions, scenarios? Yes, of course, we'll send them.
Thank you. That's very kind. And just by way of further information, on the fund, there's just a couple of URLs for websites here. I won't bore you with them. These were just taken from a Google search. These slides will be available. We'll email them to everybody who is registered for the session today. But also, it's recorded and will go onto the Preschool Learning Alliance's YouTube site. So don't try and write all of these down, but you could find them easily just by doing a Google search on employing an apprentice. The first one talks about the funding arrangements, which is a joy to read, you can imagine. But more importantly, give your business a boost, which again talks about the benefits that government receives of the whole apprenticeship programme. And as I say, I'll probably sign off where I started, that whilst apprentices may have had not the greatest reputation over the last 10, 15 years in our sector, I think they should not be disregarded, and that actually they are seen very much by government as the best way of training across a whole number of settings, and early years is one of those. So if you've not looked at them before, or if you've had a rather jaundiced view of apprentices in the past, I would encourage you to look at them again to see if they are appropriate for your provision.
Yeah, absolutely. And just and I couldn't reiterate enough, just take your time to get the right person. Put some time aside and focus on that, and it really does pay off.
Smashing. Thank you. Whilst we'll just wait for a couple of seconds to see if anybody else has any further questions, if they're typing furiously as we waffle on. Otherwise, from my point of view, and I'll let Velda sign off, thank you for your time and your contributions. There are some challenging questions in there, and I will undertake to get them answered. It may take a couple of days for me to get back to you, because some people will have to do a lot of research, I think, but we will do. So it's thank you from me.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you all. We'll
Bye.
speak to you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.